It's lips time. It's lips time. Time for those lips. It is lips time, bro.
The boy's name was Eric. He was smart, yeah. He really had was quite smart. Chased at least 3 times a day and bothered everybody in the bar.
Oh, it's lips time. It's lips time. Lips time, Rob. All right, brubs. I tried to do this earlier, but I somehow fucked it up. So, I'm coming back for the end of chapter 16 of Donna Tartt's The Little Friend. The Little Friend, bruv. Let's go. Starting at page 393. A despairing glassine shiver ran down Danny's back as he sped past the funeral home. Airy methamphetamine clarity glittered over him in 900 directions simultaneously. Hours he'd looked for the girl, looking everywhere, combing the town, cruising the residential streets, loop after endless crawling loop, and now, just as he'd made up his mind to forget about Fair and stop talking, here she was, with catfish no less. That was the hell of it. Of course, you never could tell exactly where catfish might pop up, since his uncle was one of the richest men in town, white or black. Why is this what? The little things in it, bruv. What do you want me to do? Get rid of my fingers? Some motherfucker's got to hold this page. Of course, you could never tell exactly where catfish might pop up, since his uncle was one of the richest men in town. White or black, presiding over a sizable business empire, which included grave digging, tree pruning, house painting, stump grinding, roof contracting. There you go. I said it. Numbers running, car and small appliance repair, and half a dozen other businesses. You never knew where catfish might pop up in. Collecting his uncle's rents on a ladder at the courthouse, washing windows, behind the wheel of a taxicab, or in a hearse. But, explain this 20-car pileup of freaked out reality, because it was a little too much of a coincidence to see the girl of all people sitting there with catfish in the back of a D. Bienville funeral limousine. Catfish knew there was a very large shipment of product waiting to go out, and he was just a little too casually curious about where Danny and Farish were keeping it. Yes, he'd been a little inquisitive in his easygoing, talkative way, had twice made a point of dropping by the trailer, nosing up unannounced in his Gran Torino, shadowy behind the tinted windows. He'd spent an unusually long time in the bathroom, knocking around, running the taps full blast, that is. He stood up a little too quick when Danny came outside and caught him looking underneath the Trans Am. Ever selling book, no one buys. Selling boob. Yeah, selling boob will make you way more money than books. He spent an unusually long time in the bathroom, knocking around, running the taps full blast. He'd stood up a little too quick when Danny came outside and caught him looking underneath the Trans Am. Flat tire, he'd said, though. Thought you had a flat tire, man. But the tire was fine, and they both knew it. No, Catfish and the girl were the least of his problems, he thought, with a hopeless feeling of inevitability as he bumped down the gravel road to the water tower. Seemed like he was bumping down it all the time in his bed, in his dreams, 25 times a day, hitting this exact same pothole. No, it wasn't just the drugs, all this feeling of being watched. The break-in at Eugene's and the attack upon Gum had them all glancing over their shoulders constantly and jumping at the slightest sound. But the biggest worry now was Farish, who was overheated to the boiling point. This is The Little Friend by Donna Tartt. I've read, I think, 25 previous parts of the book. With Gum in the hospital, there had been no reason for Farish even to pretend to go to bed anymore. Instead, he sat up all night, every night, and he made Danny sit up with him, pacing, plotting with the curtains drawn against the sunrise, chopping drugs on the mirror and talking himself hoarse. And now that Gum was home again, stoic and curious, shuffling sleepy-eyed past the doorway, on her way to the toilet, her presence in the house didn't break the pattern, but increased Ferris's anxiety to a very nearly unbearable pitch. A loaded .38 appeared on the coffee table beside the mirror and the razor blades. Parties, dangerous parties, were out to get him. Their grandmother's safety was at risk. And yes, Danny might shake his head at certain of Ferris's theories, but who knew? Dolphus Reese, persona non grata since the incident, often bragged of his connections with organized crime, an organized crime who handled the distribution end of the drug business, had been in bed with the CIA ever since the Kennedy assassination. Yeah, it is the little friend, bruvs. It ain't me, said Farish, pinching his nose and sitting back. Phew, it ain't me I'm worried about. It's poor little Gum in there. What kind of motherfuckers are we dealing with? I don't give a shit about my own life. Hell, I've been chased barefoot through the jungle. I hid in a mud-ass rice paddy for a solid week, breathing through a bamboo pole. There isn't shit they can do to me. Do you hear? Said Farish, pointing the blade of his clasp knife at the test pattern on the television. There isn't shit you can do to me. Danny crossed his legs to keep his knee from jittering and said nothing. Farish's ever more frequent discussion of his war record disturbed him, since Farish had spent most of the Vietnam years in the state asylum at Whitfield. Usually Farish saved his Nam stories for the pool hall. Danny had thought it was bullshit. Only recently had Farish revealed to him that the government shook certain prisoners and mental patients out of their beds at night, rapists, nuts, expendable folk, and sent them on top-secret military operations they weren't expected to come back from. Black helicopters in the prison's cotton fields at night, the guard towers empty, a mighty wind gusting through dry stalks. Men in balaclavas toting AK-47s. And tell you what, said Farish, glancing over his shoulder before he spat into the can he carried around with him, they weren't all speaking English. What had worried Danny was that the meth was still on the property, though Farish hid and re-hid it compulsively several times a day. According to Farish, he had to sit on it a while before he could move it, but moving it, Danny knew, was the real problem now that Dolphus was out of the picture. Catfish had offered to hook them up with someone some cousin in South Louisiana, but that was before Farish had witnessed the snooping under the car episode and charged outside with the knife and threatened to cut Catfish's head off. And Catfish wisely hadn't come around since then, hadn't even called on the telephone. But unfortunately, Farish's suspicions did not end there. He was watching Danny too, and he wanted Danny to know it. Sometimes he made sly insinuations or got all crafty and confidential, pretending to let Danny in on non-existent secrets. Other times, he sat back in his chair like he'd figured something out, and with a great big smile on his face said, "You son of a bitch, you son of a bitch." And sometimes he just jumped up with no warning and started screaming, charging Danny with all kinds of imaginary lies and betrayals. The only way for Danny to keep Farish from going really nuts and beating the shit out of him was to remain calm at all times. No matter what Farish said or did, patiently he endured Farish's accusations, which came unpredictably and explosively at bewildering intervals, answering slowly and with care, all politeness, nothing fancy, no sudden movements, the psychological equivalent of exiting his vehicle with his hands above his head. Then, one morning before sunrise, just as the birds were starting to sing, Farish had leapt to his feet, raving, muttering, blowing his nose repeatedly into a bloody handkerchief. He produced a knapsack and demanded to be driven into town. Once there, he ordered Danny to drop him off in the middle of town and then drive back home and wait for his phone call. But Danny, pissed off finally after all the abuse, the groundless accusations, had not done this. Instead, he'd driven around the corner, parked the car in the empty parking lot at the Presbyterian church, and on foot, at a cautious distance, followed Farish, stumping angrily down the sidewalk with his army knapsack. He'd hidden the drugs in the old water tower behind the train tracks. Danny was fairly sure of this because, after losing Farish in the overgrown wilderness around the switching yards, he'd caught sight of him away in the distance on the tower ladder, high in the air, climbing laboriously, his knapsack in his teeth, a portly silhouette against the preposterously rosy dawn sky. He turned right around, walked back to his car, and driven straight home, outwardly calm, but his mind all abuzz. That's where it was hidden, in the tower, and there it still sat, $5,000 worth of methamphetamine, $10,000 when stepped on. Farish's money, not his. He'd see a few $100s, whatever Farish decided to give him, whenever it got sold, but a few $100 wasn't enough to move to Shreveport or Baton Rouge. Not enough to get himself an apartment and a girlfriend, and set himself up in the long-distance truck driving business. Heavy metal on the 8-track, no more country music once he got away from this hillbilly town, not ever. Big chrome truck, smoked windows, air-conditioned cab, screaming down the Interstate West, away from Gum, away from Curtis with the sad teenage pimples that were starting to spring up on his face, away from the faded school picture of himself that hung over the television in Gum's trailer, skinny, furtive-looking, with long, dark bangs. Danny parked the car, lit a cigarette, and sat. The tank itself, some 45 feet off the ground, was a wooden barrel with a peaked cap. Atop spindly metal legs, a rickety utility ladder led to the top of the tank, where a trapdoor opened onto a reservoir of water. Night and day, the image of the knapsack stayed with Danny, like a Christmas present on a high shelf he wasn't supposed to climb up and look at. Whenever he got in his car, it tugged at him with a magnetic fascination. Twice already, he'd driven alone to the tank just to sit and look up at it and daydream. A fortune, his getaway. If it was his, which it wasn't, and he was more than a little worried about climbing up to get it, for fear that Farish had sawn through a rung of the ladder or rigged the trapdoor with a spring gun or otherwise booby-trapped the tower. Farish, who had taught Danny how to construct a pipe bomb. Farish, whose laboratory was surrounded with homemade punji traps fashioned from boards and rusty nail, and laced about with tripwires concealed in the weeds. Farish, who had recently ordered from an advertisement in the back of Soldier of Fortune a kit for constructing spring-loaded ballistic knives. "Trip this, sweetheart, and wing," he said, leaping up exhilarated from his work on the cluttered floor, while Danny, appalled, read a sentence on the back of the cardboard box that said, disables attackers at a range of up to 35 feet. Who knew how he'd rigged the... If it was rigged at all, it was, knowing Farish, rigged to maim, not kill. But Danny did not relish losing a finger or an eye. And yet, an insistent little whisper kept reminding him that Farish might not have rigged the tower at all. At all. 20 minutes earlier, while driving to the post office to mail his grandmother's light bill, an insane burst of optimism had struck Danny, a dazzling vision of the carefree life awaiting him in South Louisiana, and he'd turned on Main Street and driven to the switching yards with the intentions of climbing straight up the tower, fishing out the bag, hiding it in the trunk in the spare tire, and driving right out of town without looking back. But now he was here. He was reluctant to get out of the car. Nervy little silver glints like wire glinted in the weeds at the tower's foot. Hands trembling from the crank, Danny lit a cigarette and stared up at the water tower. Having a finger or a toe blown off would be pleasant compared to what Farish would do if he had even the slightest clue what Danny was thinking. And you could read a whole lot into the fact that Farish had hidden the drugs in a water tank of all places, a deliberate slap in Danny's face. Farish knew how afraid Danny was of water, ever since their father had tried to teach him to swim when he was 4 or 5 by chunking him off a pier into a lake. But instead of swimming, as Farish and Mike and his other brothers had done when the trick was tried on them, he sank. He remembered it all very clearly. The terror of sinking and the terror of choking and spitting up the gritty brown water as his father, furious at having to jump in the lake fully clothed, screamed at him, and when Danny came away from that worn-out pier, it was without much desire to swim in deep water ever again. Farish, perversely, had also ignored the practical dangers of storing crystal in such a nasty, damp place. Danny had been in the lab with Farish one rainy day in March when the stuff refused. All right, let's get back to... There we go. When the stuff refused to crystallize because of the humidity. No matter how they fooled with it, it stuck together and caked up on the mirror under their fingertips in a sticky, solid patty, useless. Danny, feeling defeated, had a little bump to steady his nerves, and then threw his cigarette out the window and started the car. Once he was out on the street again, he forgot his real errand, his grandmother's bill to mail, and took another spin by the funeral home. But though Catfish was still sitting in the limo, the girl wasn't, and there were too many people milling around on the front steps. Maybe I'll circle the block again, he thought. Alexandria, flat and desolate. A circuit of repeating street signs, a giant train set. The sense of unreality was what got you after a while. Airless streets, colorless skies, buildings empty, only pasteboard and sham. And if you drive long enough, he thought, you always end up right back where you started. Grace Fountain, rather self-consciously, came up the front steps, and in the front door of Edie's house, she followed the voices and the festive tinkle of glass through a hallway, narrowed by massive glass front bookcases, to a crowded parlor. A fan whirred. The room was packed with people, men with jackets off, ladies with pink faces. On the lace tablecloth stood a bowl of punch and plates of beaten biscuits and ham, silver compotes of peanuts and candied almonds, a stack of red paper napkins. Tacky, noted Mrs. Fountain, with Edie's monogram in gold. Mrs. Fountain, clutching her purse, stood in the doorway and waited to be acknowledged. As houses went, Edie's home, a bungalow really, was smaller than her own, but Mrs. Fountain came from country people, good Christians, as she liked to point out, but hill folk all the same, and she was intimidated by the punch bowl, by the gold silk draperies and the big plantation dining table, which even with the leaf out sat 12 at least, and by the overbearing portrait of Judge Cleaves's father, which dwarfed the tiny mantel. Around the perimeter of the room stood at taut attention, as if at a dancing school, 24 lyre-backed dining chairs with petite point seats, and if the room was a bit small and a bit low in the ceiling to accommodate so much large, dark furniture, Mrs. Fountain felt daunted by it all the same. Edith, with a white cocktail apron over her black dress, spotted Mrs. Fountain, laid down her tray of biscuits, and came over. "Why, Grace, thank you for stopping by." She wore heavy black eyeglasses, men's glasses, like those that Mr. Fountain's deceased husband, Porter, used to wear. Not very flattering, thought Mrs. Fountain. For a lady, she was also drinking from a kitchen tumbler wrapped at the bottom with a damp Christmas napkin, what appeared to be whiskey with ice. I really need something to hold this frickin' page down. So let's do that. Mrs. Fountain, unable to restrain herself, remarked, "Looks like you're celebrating, having all the big party over here after the funeral." "Well, you can't just lay down and die," snapped Edie. "Go over and get yourself some hors d'oeuvres while they're hot." "Why don't you?" Mrs. Fountain, thrown into confusion, stood very still and allowed her gaze to wander, unfocused over distant objects. I'm really reading bad right now. At last she replied vaguely, "Thank you," and walked stiffly to the buffet table. Edie put her cold glass to her temple. Before this day, Edie had been tipsy less than half a dozen times in her life, and all those times before she was 30, and in vastly more cheerful circumstances. "Edith, dear, can I help you with anything?" A woman from the Baptist church, short, round in the face, a good-natured little fluster in her manner, like Winnie the Pooh, and for the life of her, Edith couldn't recall her name. "No, thank you," she said, patting the lady on the back as she moved through the crowd. The pain in her ribs was breathtaking, but in a strange way she was grateful of it because it helped her concentrate upon the guest and the guest book and the clean glasses, upon the hot hors d'oeuvres and the replenishment of the cracker tray, and the regular addition of fresh ginger ale to the punch bowl. And these worries in turn distracted her from Libby's death, which had not yet sunk in. In the past few days, a hectic, grotesque blur of doctors, flowers, morticians, papers to be signed, and people arriving from out of town. She had not shed a tear. She had devoted herself to the get-together after the funeral. The silver to be polished, the punch cups to be hauled down, jingling from the attic and washed partly for the sake of the out-of-town guests, some of whom hadn't seen each other in years. Naturally, no matter how sad the occasion, everyone wanted a chance to catch up. I'd like to catch up with this book. God damn it, Jim. Let me just read. And Edie was grateful for a reason to keep moving and smiling and refilling the compotes of candied almonds. The night before, she had tied her hair in a white rag and hurried around with dustpan and furniture polish and carpet sweeper, fluffing cushions, cleaning mirrors, moving furniture, and shaking rugs and scrubbing floors until after midnight. She arranged the flowers, she rearranged the plates in her china cabinet. Then she had gone into her spotless kitchen and run a big sink of soapy water, and hands trembling from fatigue, washed punch cup after dusty, delicate punch cup. 100 punch cups in all, and when at 3 a.m. she finally climbed into bed, she had slept the sleep of the blessed. Libby's little pink-nosed cat, Blossom, the newest addition to the household, had retreated in terror to Edie's bedroom, where she was crouching under the bed. On top of bookcase and china cabinet, perched Edie's own cats, all 5 of them, Dot and Salambo, Ramses and Hannibal and Slim, sitting well apart, switching their tails and glaring down at the proceedings with witchy yellow eyes. Generally, Edie enjoyed guests no more than the cats did, but this day she was grateful for the multitudes, a distraction from her own family, whose behavior was unsatisfactory. more irritant than comfort. She was tired of them all, Addie especially, swanning around with horrible old Mr. Sumner. Mr. Sumner, the smooth talker, the flirt. Mr. Sumner, whom their father, the judge, had despised. And there was she, and there she was, touching his sleeve and batting her eyes at him, and she sipped punch she had not helped to make from cups she had not helped to wash. Addie, who had not come out to sit with Libby a single afternoon while she was in the hospital because she was afraid of missing her nap. She was tired of Charlotte, too, who had not come to the hospital either because she was too busy lying in the bed with whatever imaginary vapors plagued her. She was tired of Taddy, who had come to the hospital plenty, but only to deliver unwelcome scenarios of how Edith might have avoided the car accident and reacted better to Allison's incoherent phone call. She was tired of the children and their extravagant weeping at funeral parlor and gravesite. Out back on the porch they still sat, carrying on just as they had done over the dead cat. No difference, thought Edie bitterly, no difference in the world. Equally distasteful were the crocodile tears of Cousin Dell, who hadn't visited Libby in years. It's like losing mother again, Taddy had said. But Libby had been both mother and sister to Edie. More than this, she was the only person in the world, male or female, living or dead, whose opinion had ever mattered to Edie one jot. Upon two of these lyre-back dining chairs, old friends in disaster, crowding around the walls of this little room, their mother's casket had been laid in Tribulation's murky downstairs parlor more than 60 years ago. A circuit preacher, Church of God, not even Baptist, had read from the Bible a psalm something to do with gold and onyx. Except he had read onyx as oinks, a family joke thereafter. Oinks, poor teenage Libby, wan and thin, in an old black tea dress of their mother's pinned at the hem and bosom, her china pale face naturally without color, drained by sleeplessness and grief to a sick, dry chalk. What Edie remembered best was how her own hand in Libby's felt moist and hot, how she'd stared the whole time at the preacher's feet, though he'd attempted to catch Edie's eye. She was too shy to look him in the face, and over half a century later, she still saw the cracks in the leather of his lace-up shoes, the rusty slash of sunlight falling across the cuffs of his black trousers. The death of her father, the judge, had been one of those passings that everyone called a blessing, and that funeral oddly jolly, with lots of old red-faced compatriots, as the judge and his friends called one another, and his fishing pals and bar association cronies standing with their backs to the fireplace in Tribulation's downstairs parlor, drinking whiskey and swapping stories about Old Bully in his youth and boyhood. Old Bully, that was their nickname for him, and scarcely 6 months later, little Robin, which she could not bear to think of, even now, that tiny coffin, scarcely 5 feet long. How had she ever got through that day? Shot full of compazine, a grief so strong that it hit her like nausea, like food poisoning, vomiting up black tea and boiled custard. She glanced up from her fog and was badly unnerved to see a small robin-like shape in tennis shoes and cut-off jeans creeping down her hallway. The hall boy, she realized after a stunned moment or two, Harriet's friend, who in the world had let him in. Edie slipped into the hallway and stole up behind him. When she grabbed his shoulder, he jumped and screamed, a small, wheezing, terrified scream, and cowered from her as a mouse from an owl. "Can I help you?" "Harriet, I'm not Harriet. Harriet's my granddaughter," said Edie, and crossed her arms and watched him with the sportive relish at his discomfort, which had made Healy despise her. Healy tried again. Aye, go on, spit it out. "Is she here?" "Yes, she's here. Now run along home." She grabbed his shoulders and turned him manually towards the door. The boy shrugged free. "Is she going back to camp?" "There isn't playtime," snapped Edie. The boy's mother, a flirtatious little sass since childhood, had not bothered to show up for Libby's funeral. Had not sent flowers or even called. Run, tell your mother not to let you bother folks when there's been a death in the house. Now scat, she cried as he still stood gaping at her. No, I lost my spot. She stood watching at the door as he went down the steps, and taking his time about it, mooched around the corner and out of sight. Then she went to the kitchen, retrieved the whiskey bottle from the cabinet under the sink, and freshened her toddy, and walked back to the living room to check on her guests. The crowd was thinning. Charlotte, who was very rumpled and damp-looking and pink in the face, as if from strenuous exertion, stood at her post by the punch bowl, smiling with a dazed expression at pug-faced Mrs. Chafin from the florist's, who chattered to her companionably between sips of punch. Here's my advice, she was saying or shouting, for Mrs. Chafin, like many deaf people, tended to raise her own voice instead of asking other people to raise theirs. Fill the nest. It's terrible to lose a child, but I see a lot of death in my business, and the best thing for it is to get busy and have a few more little ones. Edie noted a large run in the back of her daughter's stocking. Being in charge of the punch bowl was not a very demanding task. Harriet or Allison could have done it, and Edie would have assigned either of them the job, had she not felt it inappropriate for Charlotte to stand around the reception staring tragically into space. But I don't know what to do, she'd said in a frightened little squeak when Edie had marched her to the punch bowl and slapped the ladle in her hand. Fill their cups and give them more if they want it. In dismay, as if the ladle were a monkey wrench and the punch bowl a complicated piece of machinery, Charlotte glanced at her mother. Several ladies from the choir, smiling hesitantly, lingered politely by the cups and saucers. Edie snatched the ladle from Charlotte, dipped it, filled the cup, and set it on a tablecloth, then handed the ladle back to Charlotte. Down at the end of the table, little Miss Teagarden, all in green, like a small, spry tree frog with her wide mouth and large liquid eyes, turned theatrically with her freckled hand to her breast. Gracious, she cried, is that for me? Certainly, called Edie in her brightest stage voice, as the ladies, now beaming, began to migrate in their direction. Charlotte touched her mother's sleeve urgently. But what should I say to them? Isn't that refreshing, said Mrs. Teagarden loudly. Do I taste ginger ale? I don't reckon you have to say anything, Edie said quietly to Charlotte. And then in full voice to the assembled company, yes, it's just a plain little non-alcoholic punch. Nothing special, just what we have at Christmas. Mary Grace, Catherine, won't you have something to drink? Oh, Edith. In pressed the choir ladies. Doesn't this look lovely? I don't know how you find the time. Edith's such a capable hostess, she just throws it all together at a moment's notice. This from cousin Lucinda, who had just strode up, hands in the pockets of her skirt. Oh, it's easy for Edith, Adelaide was heard to say in a thin voice. She's got a freezer. Edie, ignoring the slight, had made the necessary introductions and slipped away. Leaving Charlotte to the punch bowl, all Charlotte needed was to be told what to do, and she was fine, so long as there wasn't independent thought or decision of any sort. Robin's death had really been a double loss, for she'd lost Charlotte too. Her busy, bright daughter, altered so tragically, ruined. Really. All right, that's clunky. Certainly, one never got over such a blow, but it had been more than 10 years. People pulled themselves together somehow, moved along. Ruefully, Edie thought back to Charlotte's girlhood, when Charlotte had announced she wanted to be a fashion buyer for a large department store. Mrs. Chafin placed her punch cup in the saucer, which was balanced in the palm of her left hand. You know, she was saying, poinsettias can be lovely at a Christmas funeral. The church can be so dark this time of year. Edie stood with her arms across her chest and watched them. As soon as she found the right moment, she meant to have a little word with Mrs. Chafin herself. Though Dix was unable, on such short notice, so Charlotte had said to drive down from Nashville for the funeral. The arrangement of mock orange and iceberg roses he'd sent. Too decorative, too tasteful, feminine somehow, had caught Edie's attention. Certainly was more sophisticated than Mrs. Chafin's usual arrangements. Then at the funeral home, she'd walked into a room where Mrs. Hatfield Keene was giving Mrs. Chafin a hand with the flowers, only to hear Mrs. Keene say, stiffly, as if in reply to an inappropriate confidence, well, she might have been Dixon's secretary. Adjusting a spray of gladiolus, Mrs. Chafin sniffed and cocked her head shrewdly to one side. Well, I answered the telephone and took the order myself, she said, stepping back to observe her handiwork. And she sure didn't sound like a secretary to me. Healy did not go home, but merely turned the corner and circled around to the side gate of Edie's yard, where he found Harriet sitting in Edie's backyard, glider swing. Without preamble, he marched up and said, "Hey, when'd you get home?" He had expected his presence to cheer her immediately, and when it didn't, he was annoyed. "Did you get my letter?" he said. "I got it," said Harriet. She had eaten herself half sick on candied almonds from the buffet, and their taste lingered disagreeably in her mouth. "You shouldn't have sent it." Healy sat down in the swing beside her. "I was freaked out. With a curt nod, Harriet indicated Edie's porch, 20 feet away, where 4 or 5 adults with punch cups stood behind the dim screen chatting. Healy took a deep breath. In a quieter voice, he said, "It's been scary here. He drives all over town, real slow, like he's looking for us. I've been in the car with my mother, and there he is, parked by the underpass, like he's staking it out." The two of them, though they were sitting side by side, were looking straight ahead at the grown-ups on the porch and nodded at each other. Harriet said, "You didn't go back up there to get the wagon, did you?" "No," said Healy, shocked. "Do you nuts? For a while he was there every day. Lately he's been going down to the freight yards by the railroad tracks." "Why?" "How should I know? A couple of days ago I got bored and went down to the warehouse to hit some tennis balls. Then I heard a car, and it's lucky I hid because it was him. I've never been so scared. He parked his car and he sat for a while. Then he got up and walked around. Maybe he followed me. I don't know." Harriet rubbed her eyes and said, "I saw him driving that way a little while ago today." "Towards the train tracks?" "Maybe. I wondered where he was going." "I'm just glad he didn't see me," said Healy. "When he got out of his car, I nearly had a heart attack. I was hiding in the bushes for about an hour." "We should go over on a special op and see what he's doing down there." She had thought the phrase special op would be irresistible to Healy, and she was surprised by how firmly and swiftly he said, "Not me. I'm not going down there again. You don't understand." His voice had risen sharply. A grown-up on the porch turned a bland face in their direction. Harriet nudged him in the ribs. He looked at her, aggrieved. "But you don't understand," he said in a quieter voice. "You had to see it. He would have killed me if he saw me. You could tell by the way he was looking around." Healy imitated the expression, face distorted, eyes roving wildly over the ground. "Looking for what?" "I don't know. I mean it. I'm not messing with him anymore, Harriet, and you better not either. If him or any of his brothers figure out it's us that threw that snake, we're dead. Didn't you read that thing from the newspaper I sent you?" "I didn't get the chance." "Well, it was his grandma," said Healy austerely. "She nearly died." Edie's garden gate creaked open. Suddenly, Harriet leaped up. "Odeon!" she cried, but the little black lady in straw hat and belted cotton dress cut her eyes at Harriet without turning her head and did not reply. Her lips were compressed, her face rigid. Slowly, she shuffled to the back porch and up the stairs and rapped on the door. "Miss Edith here?" she said, hand to brow, peering through the screen. After a moment's hesitation, Harriet, stunned, cheeks burning from the snub, sat back down in the swing. Though Odine was old and grumpy and Harriet's relationship with her had never been very good, no one had been closer to Libby. The two of them were like an old married couple, not only in their disagreements, mostly about Libby's cat, which Odine despised, but also in their stoic, companionable affection for one another, and Harriet's heart had risen violently at the very sight of her. She had not thought of Odine since the accident. Odine had been with Libby since they were both young women, out at tribulation, Where would she go now? What would she do? Odine was a rickety old lady in poor health, and as Edie often complained, not much use around the house anymore. Confusion on the screen porch. There, said somebody inside, moving to make room, and Tat stepped sideways to the front. Odine, she said, you know me, don't you, Edith's sister? Why ain't nobody told me about Miss Libby? Oh my, Odine. Glanced backwards at the porch, perplexed, ashamed. I'm so sorry. Why don't you come inside? May Helen, who works for Miss McLemore, done come and told me. Nobody come and got me. And y'all already put her into the ground. Oh, Odine, we didn't think you had a telephone. In the silence followed, a chickadee whistled 4 clear, bouncy, sociable notes. Y'alls could have come and got me, Odine's voice cracked. Her coppery face was immobile. At my house, I lives out at Pine Hill. You know it. Y'alls could have gone to that trouble. Odine, oh my, said Tat. Helplessly, she took a deep breath. She looked about. Please, won't you come in and sit down a minute? No'm, said Odine stiffly. I thank you. Odine, I'm so sorry. We didn't think. Odine dashed away a tear. I worked for Miss Lib 55 years, and nobody ain't even told me she's in the hospital. Tat closed her eyes for an instant. Odine, there was a dreadful silence. Oh, this is horrible. How can you forgive us? This whole week I'm thinking you's all up in South Carolina. I was supposed to come back to work on Monday, and here she is, laying in the ground. Please, Tat, lay a hand on Odine's arm. Wait here while I run, get Edith. Will you wait here just a moment? She flustered inside. Conversation, not very clear, resumed on the porch. Odine, expressionless, turned and stared into the middle distance. Someone, a man, said in a strange stage whisper, I believe she wants a little money. Blood rose hot to Harriet's face. Odine, dull-faced, unblinking, stood where she was without moving. Amongst all the large white people in their Sunday finery, she looked very small and drab, a lone wren in a flock of starlings. Healy had got up and was standing behind the swing, observing the scene with frank interest. Harriet didn't know what to do. She felt as if she should go over and stand with Odine. It was what Libby would want her to do, but Odine didn't seem very friendly or welcoming. In fact, there was something forbidding in her manner that frightened Harriet. Suddenly, quite without warning, there was movement on the porch, and Allison burst through the door into Odine's arms, so that the old lady, wild-eyed at the abrupt onslaught, had to catch the porch rail to keep from falling over backwards. Allison sobbed with an intensity frightening even to Harriet. Odine stared over Allison's shoulder without returning or appearing to welcome the hug. Edie came through and out onto the steps. Allison, get back in the house, she said, and grabbing Allison's shoulder, turning her around. Now! Allison, with a sharp cry, wrenched away and ran across the yard, past the glider swing, past Healy and Harriet, into Edie's tool shed. There was a tinny crash, as of a rake toppling off the wall at the slammed door. Healy said flatly as he swiveled his head to stare, Man, your sister's nuts. From the porch, Edie's voice, clear, carrying, resonated with an air of public address, formal though it was. Emotion trembled behind it, and also something of emergency. Odine, thank you for coming. Won't you step inside for a minute? No, I don't want to bother nobody. Don't be ridiculous. We're mighty glad to see you. Healy kicked Harriet in the foot. Say, he said, and nodded at the tool shed. What's the matter with her? Bless your heart, Edie, scolded Odine, who stood motionless. Enough of this. You come inside right this minute. Harriet could not speak. From the decrepit tool shed, a single weird, dry sob, as if of a choked creature. Harriet's face constricted, not with disgust or even embarrassment, but with some foreign, frightening emotion which made Healy step away from her as if she had an infectious disease. Ah, he said cruelly, looking over her head. Clouds, an airplane trailing over the sky. I think I have to go now. He waited for her to say something, and when she didn't, he sauntered away, not as usual scurrying gait, but self-consciously swinging his arms. The gate snapped shut. Harriet stared furiously at the ground. The voices on the porch had risen sharply, and with a dull pain, Harriet became aware of what they were talking about. Libby's will. Where it is, Odium was saying. Don't worry, that'll all be taken care of soon enough, said Edie, taking Odine's arms as if to guide her inside. The will's in her safe deposit box. On Monday morning, I'll go with the lawyer. I ain't trusting any lawyer, Odine said fiercely. Miss Lib made a promise. She told me, she say, Odine, if anything happened, look there in my cedar chest. There's an envelope in there for you. You just go on and do it and don't ask nobody. Odine, we haven't touched any of her things. On Monday, the Lord knows what went on, said Odine haughtily. He knows it, and I know it. Yes, ma'am, I surely do know what Miss Libby told me. You know Mr. Billy Wentworth, don't you? Edie's voice, jocular as if speaking to a child, but with a hoarseness that edged on something terrifying. Don't tell me that you don't trust Mr. Billy, Odine. That's in practice with his son-in-law down there on the square. All's I want is what's coming to me. The garden glider was rusted. Moss swelled velvetly between the cracked bricks. Harriet, with a kind of desperate clenching effort, fixed the whole of her attention upon a battered conch shell lying at the base of a garden urn. Edie said, Odine, I'm not disputing that. You'll get what's legally yours, and as soon as I don't know about anything legal. All I know is what's right. The conch was chalky with age, weathered to a texture like crumbly plaster. Its apex had broken off at the inner lip. It sank into a pearly flush, the delicate silvery pink of Edie's old maiden's blush roses. Before Harriet was born, the whole family had vacationed on the Gulf every year. After Robin died, they never went back. Jars of tiny gray bivalves collected on those old trips sat on high shelves in the aunts' closets, dusty and sad. They lose their magic when they've been out of the water a while, Libby said, and she'd run the bathroom sink full of water, poured the shells in, and pulled over a step stool for Harriet to stand on. She'd been tiny, around 3, and how gigantic and white the sink had seemed, and how surprised she had been to see that uniform gray washed bright and slick and magical, broken into 1,000 tinkling colors. Empurpled here, soaked there to muscle black, fanned into ribs and spiraling into delicate polychrome, whorls, silver, marble blue, coral and pearly green and rose. How cold and clear was the water, her own hands cut off at the wrist, icy pink and tender. Smell, said Libby, breathing deep. That's what the ocean smells like, and Harriet put her face close to the water and smelled the stiff tang of an ocean she had never seen. The salt smell that Jim Hawkins spoke of in Treasure Island, crash of the surf, scream of strange birds, and the white sails, of the Hispaniola, like the white pages of a book, billowing against cloudless, hot skies. Death, they all said, was a happy shore. In the old seaside photographs, her family was young again, and Robin stood among them, boats and white handkerchiefs, seabirds lifting into light. It was a dream where everybody was saved, but it was a dream of life past, not life to come. Life present, rusty magnolia leaves, lichen-crusted flower pots, the hum of bees steady in the hot afternoon, and the faceless murmurs of the funeral guests. Mud and slimy grass, under the cracked garden brick she'd kicked aside. Harriet studied the ugly spot on the ground with great attention, as if it were the one true thing in the world, which, in a way, it was. That's the end of chapter 6. Next time, the Tawa. The Tawa. What page is this? 413. How many pages are left? 140. All right, Brobs, that's all. That's all. We got nothing. Goodbye, Brob.